On the morning of April 18, 2007, residents of the quiet village of Mapalad in Santa Rosa Town, Nueva Ecija, woke up to an alarming sight. A dead man lay sprawled beside the main highway that cuts through the village.
Nagtitinda yata ng pandesal yun, nakakita eh. So, nireport sa akin na meron niya raw tao dito na iniwan, patay. So, tumawag na kami agad ng pulis.
Aside from the few items found in the man's pockets, there was little in the way of clues. What was clear was that the man was badly beaten before he was killed with a gunshot to the head.
May tama ng bala sa chin, saka basag yung panga. Parang pinaharapan muna bago tinapon sa lugar na yun.
Police later identified the victim through the driver's license found in his pocket. He was Carmelo Palacios, 41 years old, a widower, and a father of 3. Palacios was also a radio journalist for the state-owned Radyo ng Bayan, covering Nueva Ecija, a rice-producing province almost 100 kilometers north of Metro Manila, where intense and bloody political rivalries have earned it a permanent place among the country's notorious election hotspots. Christian Palacios still remembers the last time he saw his father, on April 17, the day he disappeared.
Yan, yung araw po ng Sabado kasi, nanghihingi po ako ng loan sa kanya. Ganun.
Loan?
Opo. Hindi naman usual na hindi siya magte-text back sa amin kasi siya nagbibigay sa amin loan. Tapos kinukumusta niya kami lagi. Kaya yun po, nagtaka na rin kami ni Mikey noon na ng kapatid ko na bakit hindi siya nagte-text.
Christian has no doubt that his father was killed because of his job as a journalist. Yet he remembers how much his father loved what he did. But it was also a job that earned him a number of enemies. Christian recalls how his father worried at times about his safety.
Lagi niya yung sinasabi na pag, ganyan, pag nawala ako, kayo na bahala sa inyo, ganyan, na dapat alagaan niyo sa ganyo lagi kasi hindi niyo alam kung kailan talaga ako, ganun.
Nueva Ecija's media community also reacted with alarm to Palacios' murder. For most of their history, Novo Ecijanos had generally insulated their media from the violence that afflicts their politics. Palacios' murder was like a warning to local reporters.
Yung pagpatay na yon, yung unang impact niya, talagang halos lahat kinakabahan, di ba? Kasi dito sa Nueva Ecija, yon ang kauna-unahang sinasabing job-related. Dahil batay dun sa investigation, so talagang lahat kinabahan. Lahat nag-iisip, ganito na ba sa atin ngayon?
Having identified the victim, what police needed now was a motive and a suspect. But that was 4 years ago. When the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism revisited the case in 2011, police still had no motive for Palacios' murder and no suspect. For all practical purposes, the case had not moved at all from the very first day that the body was found in 2007. It is a murder case that from the start seems to have run up against a blank wall.
Wala pang nasasampang kaso dahil wala nga kami makitang suspect. Sa tagal ng panahon, hanggang ngayon nahihirapan pa nga.
The one witness who saw anything did not even see much. One resident of Barangay Mapalad told policemen that he saw the lights of a vehicle at around 10:30 in the evening of April 17. Based on the movement of the lights, the vehicle stopped and appeared to be maneuvering. The next morning, residents discovered the body of Palacios beside the highway. At first, investigators considered a variety of possible angles. In his report to the Police Provincial Director on April 25, 2007, Santa Rosa Police Chief Benjamin de la Cruz said they were looking at several motives. On the day he was killed, Palacios was supposed to guide 3 reporters from Central Luzon who were visiting Nueva Ecija. 2007 was, after all, an election year, but apparently the reporters abandoned the planned coverage when Palacios failed to appear at the appointed time. Then, police said Palacios had gotten into an earlier argument with a certain Joe from Masbate province. Palacios had apparently accused the man of illegal recruitment. Other angles included a property dispute and a rape case that Palacios was reportedly assisting. Lastly, police investigators toyed with the possibility that Palacios was killed by a communist rebel leader whom he had a fight with outside the home of Palacios' alleged girlfriend. But in the end, investigators found no clear lead to pursue. For the next 4 years, police would issue updates that basically said the same thing, that investigators were following up the case and intelligence operatives had been deployed, but still no witnesses or evidence to pin down a motive or a suspect. The last case update was in December 2009. Again, police said the search for eyewitnesses had proven futile. It ended with an assurance that any critical information gathered would be reported to police headquarters at the soonest possible time. That assurance was given almost 2 years ago and no report has been received ever since. Police admit that they are stumped. Without witnesses or any vital clues, they do not know where to proceed.
Hanggang ngayon nga, nahirapan pa yung aming investigador para isolve ang nasabing kaso.
Bakit po?
Sa unang-una, walang witness na makapagturo kung paano siya nawala, kung paano siya pinatay. Yun ang isang pangunahing dahilan para hindi masolve yung kaso.
What is really alarming is that Palacios' case is not at all unusual. His murder is just one in a growing list of murdered journalists whose cases are labeled cold or dead cases. The Freedom Fund for Filipino Journalists has listed more than 120 mediamen killed in the line of duty since press freedom was restored in 1986. Of these murders, only 10 have resulted in convictions, or a conviction rate of 8%. 46 cases are still undergoing trial, including that of the 31 victims of the 2009 Maguindanao massacre. More than half of the murders, 65 cases or 54%, are what one would call cold or dead cases, cases that never prospered with the police or the courts. The facts even become more alarming once you break them down. Of these 65 murders, 54 cases or 83% never even reached the courts. This is because police investigators had not been able to gather enough evidence to file charges against anyone. In fact, in most of these cases, police were never even able to identify a suspect, much less arrest one. Such was the case of Muhammad Yusop, a commentator for radio station DXID in Pagadian City. Yusop was shot and killed by 2 gunmen in February 2001. No one had claimed responsibility for the murder, and the police never made any arrests. Orsani Alcantara of San Pablo, Laguna, publisher of Focus and anchor of Celestron Cable Television, shot dead on August 22, 2002. No suspect was ever arrested. The list goes on, with some murders dating back more than 2 decades. Noel Miranda of the Mindanao Scanner, killed in March 1988. No witnesses, case remains under investigation. Severino Arcones of DYFM Bomboradio, Iloilo, murdered October 1989. Case remains under investigation. 15 years later, Arcones' widow, Marlene Esperat, would also be murdered because of her exposés, the biggest of which implicated officials of the Arroyo administration. Ferdinand Reyes of Dipolog, Zamboanga del Norte, killed February 1996. No arrests made. Noel Villarante of radio station DZJV in Santa Cruz, Laguna, murdered in August 2003. No arrests made. Attorney Prima Quinsayas is the legal counsel of the Freedom Fund for Filipino Journalists, a network of media groups that provides legal and financial support for families of journalists killed in the line of duty. She says if the media killings are a cause for concern, the growing number of unsolved cases are an even bigger cause for alarm.
The journalist needs a state that can actually enforce laws, a state that has a criminal justice system that can actually bring to justice those who actually have the gall to kill a journalist simply because a journalist did his job.
Quinsayas says many of these cases remain unsolved because of 2 things: the failure to gather and preserve physical and forensic evidence, and the inability to find and secure vital witnesses. The failure of one often increases the risk of failure in the other.
The dead cases really result from this. One, no law enforcement agency has been able to gather enough physical evidence to support the case. 2, witnesses are reluctant.
In the Palacios case, police were only able to recover a few personal effects of Palacios and nothing else. Robbery appeared to be an unlikely motive since Palacios still had his watch, wallet, and a small amount of money. But police could find no other evidence around the crime scene, either because there wasn't any or because they did not have the means or the manpower to look for more. All they had was a police line tape and an ordinary camera. SPO3 June Adalem is the chief investigator of the Santa Rosa Police Station. At the outset, he said investigators had virtually nothing to work with.
Walang makitang bakas, walang makita na ebidensya.
But even Adalem admits that his investigators need more training in gathering evidence. This lack of basic training is compounded by another fact of life for many government agencies: the lack of resources. In a basic forensics training course for policemen in Subic last year, investigators of the Palacios case discussed what could have gone wrong with the investigation. The points raised in the discussion may as well apply to all other murder cases all over the country. Adalem said the perennial budget problems were of course brought up, with investigators complaining that they simply had none of the high-tech equipment the public had come to expect of them after watching too many episodes of CSI. The problem was even more basic. Investigators did not have enough transportation fare to revisit the crime scene repeatedly or conduct interviews in nearby town.
Kasi hindi ka lang naman dito sa bayan na magko-concentrate. sa adjacent municipality, kailangan meron ka rin puntahin dyan, interviewin.
We have a law enforcement agency that needs a lot of support in terms of training the people who do investigation so that they get all the evidence we need. Right now, if you look at all our cases, we rely so much on testimonial evidence. We rely little on physical or object evidence, forensic evidence for that matter. You know, all those CSI that we watch on TV, they really don't apply here in the Philippines, di ba? So that's one. So when you say we depend on testimonial evidence, we depend on people. And when you speak of people, they are, you know, vulnerable. Especially when an accused is well off or has connections.
But Adalem said investigators pointed to another big issue during the discussions. In small cities and towns where most of these murders take place, police investigators handle everything, from the most gruesome murders to petty traffic accidents. It is a far cry from the more modern images projected in television crime shows, where a team of investigators lives, sleeps, eats and breathes the case until it is solved. In Santa Rosa, for example, there are only 4 police investigators for a population of 59,000 people living in 33 far-flung barangays. Given these simple statistics, Adalem says it is impossible to focus on just one case.
Sa isang investigador, pag ginawa ka niyong ganito, kailangan yun lang ang hawak. Kasi sa istasyon ganito, maliit eh. Halos ilan lang kami, 3-4 na investigador. Lahat ng kaso, puro sa amin din ang tambak. Traffic accident lang, hahawakan mo pa siya. Yung mga away barangay, dadaan lahat sa'yo. Kanya kuminsan, hindi mo masundan yung mga kasong ganito.
We could do with a lot of help in terms of training them more. It doesn't even have to be abroad. Diba? I mean, we have good people here in the Philippines, but the government is simply not allotting enough budget. Equipment, baril, those gadgets that you need when you're conducting, let's say, scene of the crime operations. We are so inadequate in that. But you'd be amazed that for instance, the NBI or the SOCO, amazed how they are still able to do it with what little they have.
But the lack of evidence or witnesses is not the only reason why cases remain unsolved. In other cases of media murders, police investigators name suspects who appear beyond the reach of the law. George and Maricel Vigo of Kidapawan, North Cotabato were block timers of Cotabato's radio station DXND and publishers of the newspaper Headliner. Both were gunned down by 3 motorcycle-riding assassins on June 19, 2006. The Philippine National Police created a special task force to go after the killers. 2 days after the murders, police investigators declared that the 2 were killed by communist rebels, a move that raised a few eyebrows. Several media groups pointed out that the Vigos had repeatedly expressed concern that they were being targeted by government security forces because they were perceived to be sympathetic to the political left. And in November 2004, a gunman shot dead Mindanews photo editor Jean Boyd Lumawag in Jolo, Sulu Province. The army immediately said that the gunman was a member of the Abu Sayyaf bandit group. However, at least one senior police official was quoted as saying that the corruption story that Lumawag and his colleague were working on may have been the motive for the murder. But even if the police should be able to arrest the killers, some police officials appear unable or unwilling to do so. On August 4, 2008, 2 gunmen shot and killed DXMD radio anchor Dennis Cuesta of General Santos City. That same year, a Philippine court issued an arrest warrant against a General Santos City police officer for Cuesta's murder, Police Inspector Redempto Acharon. Yet 3 years later, the local police claim that they have not been able to find and arrest their rogue colleague, despite persistent sightings of Acharon in the city. Acharon also happens to be the first cousin of General Santos City's former mayor and incumbent congressman Pedro Acharon. So while investigators have identified the alleged mastermind in the murder, the case has not moved forward because the suspect has not been arrested or arraigned in court. Cuesta's murder case is now one of 4 media murder cases that have been archived by the courts because of lack of progress in the case.
If you don't get the accused, the trial court never acquires jurisdiction over the person of the accused. If you don't have him, you cannot arraign him. If you cannot arraign him and he cannot plead guilty or not guilty, the criminal case ends there. It's left hanging. The Dennis Cuesta case was ordered archived by the Regional Trial Court of Makati City. Bakit? Because the accused has not been arrested. So dead case siya ngayon.
What happens when the case is archived? One is that it's taken out of the active docket of the court. Two, it is parang on suspended animation, no? Hindi siya dismiss kasi wala pa namang basihan to dismiss eh. Hindi lang siya inaaktuhan.
While better than an outright dismissal of the case, Tess says that few criminal cases that get archived are ever revived.
Practically speaking, tulog yan. Tulog na matagal, no? Depending on how long it will take before a witness comes up. The practical effect is that the case is asleep, no? Talagang dormant, literally, no? Hindi siya patay, may posibilidad na ma-revive siya, pero hanggang sa ma-revive, it's, well, parang ganun. It's as good as dead, no?
In Cuesta's case, all that is needed to revive the case is to have Police Inspector Acharon arrested and brought before the court. If and when that happens, that is the only time the trial will really start. However, the longer it takes for a case to be resolved, the harder it is to keep witnesses. Oftentimes, time works against the prosecutors of a murder case.
Since witnesses have a lifespan, let's face it, diba? Bukas makalawa, pwedeng mamatay yan. In our criminal proceedings, there is yet no rule that would allow us to get a witness's testimony, get the witness deposition, keep it under the custody of the court so that if anything, knock on wood, happens to the witness, his or her testimony is there and can just simply be pulled out and presented in court. Strengthen the witness protection program. Strengthen it, and when we say strengthen it, give it enough support, enough resources, have men and women trained in protecting witnesses, put in laws that will protect the program. For instance, the Witness Protection Program's budget is subject to congressional hearings. Can you imagine being at the mercy, let's say, of Congress, whether the Senate or the House of Representatives, and they can just, squeeze you a little, especially if, we don't know, if any of the members of Congress is connected to any of the accused whose witnesses are under the program. They can just squeeze you a little to get to know certain confidential information about the locations of the witnesses. That's scary. And yet, that's the reality of the Witness Protection Program right now.
Time also works against families of the victims who wait for justice. Mark Palacios was already a widower when he was killed. With his death in 2007, his 3 children were orphaned. Faced with mounting bills, the children have had to sell their house, which was eventually torn down. We found Christian Palacios, the second oldest child, crammed with a brother and an aunt in a small room just a few meters away from their old home. Except for 2 photos on a wall, there is little left to remind them of their father. Sometimes Christian comes back to where their old house used to stand to remember the days when his father was still alive.
Nawala po siya kasi biglaan. Yung wala po kaming alam kung saan kami kukuha ng pera, ganun po.
Hindi kayo handa eh?
Oo, hindi po talaga kami handa. Tapos yun, habang tumatagal, naubos din po yung pera namin kasi pag-aaral, ganun. Tapos yung ate ko, nagkaroon siya ng asawa, ganun. Kaya po yun, napilitan din po kami benta to kasi wala na rin kami halos pera para pang
Christian had hoped to become a Mormon missionary. For him, it was his way of following in his father's footsteps, his own way of helping. But he has had to stop because there was no money to support him. Christian is now torn. On one hand, he has always hoped that his father would finally get justice. Yet he is terrified of finding out who killed his father because this would put what is left of his family in danger once again. It is the tragic irony of the survivor. But more than that, it is a sad commentary of what little confidence survivors have that they would ever get justice from the police or from the courts.
Gusto ko po kasi yung maging tahimik po yung buhay namin. Saka para hindi na po kami kabahan kung may magnari pa sa amin. Kung alam na namin na nakakulong na yung may sala po. Para mas maging maganda yung buhay namin. Kasi mahirap yung ganun po.
Ang pait naman nun, kayo ng biktima, kayo pa ngayon ang nakakamba.
Opo, syempre kasi alam po namin na buhay pa po yung may gawa po nun. At kahit kailan po nila gusto, kung may gusto po sila sa amin yun, pwede po nila kami balikan po dito po.
May suspetsa ba kayo kung sino yung pumatay sa kanya?
Wala po. Kasi, meron po kaso, yun nga, parang hindi na namin iniisip kasi baka mamaya madami pa po kami. Wala na kaming, pamilya, syempre. Mahirap na para sa amin kasi puro bata pa naman po kami. Yun po. Hindi namin Ano ko sino pa yung mga taong yun po.
Ang epekto, nakaka-demoralize pa rin talaga. Kasi kumbaga, hanggat walang closure yung case, sa media nakatuon yun. Tayo, na mga media workers na hindi siguro masyadong natatakot, pero may mga pamilya rin tayo na hanggang ngayon bumabanggit-banggit nun, di ba? Meron tayong mga kasama sa labas na laging inaalala na, uy, delikado ng pagiging reporter. Di ba? In general, ganun ang mababanggit nila. Pagka nga kumukuha ka ng mga data, sasabihin nila, uy, huwag mong pinakikialaman yan dahil alam mo naman na napapatay na lang media ngayon, hindi naman nagkakaroon ng katarungan.
If the government is not able to nip, it's not even nipping in the bud, because I think media killings in the Philippines has reached a stage where we are the most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist. Why are you still a journalist? It also kills our democratic institutions. Like, an intelligent citizenry would depend on how well informed the citizenry is, and how well informed they are depends on how free the press is. How free we are as journalists depends on knowing we will not be killed because we came out with a certain story.
Some days, Christian visits his father's grave at the public cemetery, although those visits have become few and far in between, as the family now tries to struggle for those who are still alive. Christian is unsure where the grave is, and when we find it, the plot is overgrown with weeds. It is a stark reminder of how long ago their father was murdered, and how slow the wheels of justice turn, when they do turn at all.
Yung dami niyang tinutulungan tao para sa problema nila, gano'n. Madami rin po ang beses yung matutulungan, yung mga napatay din, gano'n. Mga hindi nabigyan ng sisya, tapos ngayon pagdating sa kanya, gano'n din pala yung magiging resulta niya dun sa dulo na hindi rin mabibigyan ng resulta. Parang yung mga may gawa po sa kanya yun, masaya pa rin siguro ngayon kasi hanggang ngayon hindi pa rin sila nahulog.